Hey, everybody, this is Tom Sega from Duluth Pack, and this is the leader of the pack. And today, our special guest, I'm really excited today. He is a leader of a pack. This is an educator. This is an absolute canoeist and canoeing expert and an award-winning author. And we're going to talk about all of those subjects today. Our guest is the one and only Cliff Jacobson. Welcome, Cliff.
Hey, thanks, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here. It really is. It really is.
It is so exciting to have you here. So we're going to dive right in because we only have so much time and there's a lot that we want to hear about from you today, Cliff.
Okay.
So let's go back to the whole beginning for Cliff Jacobson. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? And how did you fall in love with the outdoors?
Well, I am embarrassed to say that I grew up in Chicago. Chicago is not a place for outdoor guys to grow up in, but I loved it. I mean, I loved the outdoors. I was in the Boy Scouts, and every time that there was a scout outing, I would start preparing for it literally days, weeks in advance. I just couldn't get enough of the outdoors, even though I lived in the top of a third-story apartment building in Montrose and Kedzie in Chicago, Illinois. I always hated Chicago. I always wanted out. I always wanted to be in the wilds. And if you ask me, how do you get like that? I think there's another answer to that question.
How do you get like that, Cliff?
I have pondered that for a lifetime, and I have decided it's a gene. It's a gene. Either you have it or you don't. You can take hate and you can turn it into tolerance. You can turn tolerance into like. You can turn like into love, but you can't turn hate into love. And I'll just tell you a couple stories just to how I got to this point. I used to guide canoe trips for kids in the Boundary Waters. We had a program called Wilderness Experience. We'd take them to the Boundary Waters. We had a higher level where we took them to Canada, flew in on a float plane, went in on a train. It was very exciting. Okay, I remember I remember this one girl. And she was on one of our canoe trips. It was perfect weather. There wasn't a bug in the sky. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was perfect sunshine, perfect swimming weather. Every kid was having a good time. She hated every minute of it. What do I miss? Two things: my boyfriend and my curling iron. Seriously. I had another girl, and I still remember, this is about 30 years ago. Her name was Teresa Pash. I don't remember this all these years. She loved outside so much, the kids nicknamed her Injun. They used to call her Injun. We're in the Boundary Waters with this girl. It's raining bloody murder. I mean, I have twin tarps set up and everything, but it's raining so bad that it's coming in, blowing in through the tarps and stuff. And I said, I've had enough. I'm going in my tent. That's it. There's Teresa sitting out on a rock. There's a rock right on the edge, and that's actually about 2 feet in the water, a great big rock. She's climbed up on the rock. She's got a poncho on her head, and she's just sitting there and watching it rain. Now, how did she get like that? It's a gene. I have two daughters. Both of them love their daddy to pieces, would do anything for me. They call me like almost every day. They both hate canoeing and camping. Go figure.
Maybe you burned them out, Cliff.
No, I don't think so. People think you start kids young and they're gonna love it. I started my girls in canoes when they couldn't walk. They were literally 9 months old, 8 months old, and they were in a canoe. They never liked it. Their mother, Sharon, she never liked it. She'd tolerate it, but nope, it's a gene.
It's a gene. Well, I think you got about 2 or 3 of those genes.
I certainly have 2, that's for sure.
As we get going here. So your background is a school teacher. You were an educator.
No, well, actually, I didn't start out that way. I was a forester first. I graduated in forestry from Purdue University, had a degree in forestry. And then I worked out west for Bureau Land Management. Okay. I worked out there for about 6 months. Then what happened was I was also in ROTC, and so we had the draft in those days, okay?
Yep.
And so I got called in, and of course I went on active duty. I was a second lieutenant, and I was stationed in Germany for 2 years, okay? So I was stationed in Germany for a couple of years, and while I was there, you know, I always liked shooting when I was a kid, but then when I went to college, or well, when I was in high school in ROTC, then I was on the ROTC rifle team, 22 small bore. And then when I got in college, and I still had to take ROTC to fill out my commission, so I was on the college university rifle team. And then when I got in Germany, I was in an artillery unit, 105 self-propelled howitzer unit. And then I tried out for the rifle team there, and then I got on the battery rifle team, and then I got on I got on the whole. Ultimately, I just got on the U.S. Army national team, and then instead of doing 2 years in Germany, then I wound up doing 1 year in Germany, and the other year just traveling around with the U.S. Europe rifle team, shooting matches. And that was a lot of fun. I probably shot 20,000 rounds, probably 10 to 20,000 rounds through a pair of M14s, and probably another 1,000 rounds through a 33-38 bolt gun with a scope on it. And we won. That was the year 1964. Then we won the national matches, and I think the scores we shot still stand today, because that was the last year we ever used the M14 in competition. And then they went to the M16. Okay, the M16 is probably a better combat rifle, but you get beyond about 300 yards, and it gets tough with a little 22. Whereas that 308, you'll punch holes real nice at 1,000 yards with that gun. But anyway, that's kind of my story. Then I came back, and afterwards I came back, and I did not want to go back to Coos Bay, Oregon, on the coast and be a forester again. It was a tough one. It's very rugged. Being a forester on the West Coast, very rugged. And when I was in the Army, I did a lot of teaching. That was military subjects. And I found I was really good at that, and I liked that. And so I said, hey, I think I'm going to teach biology. First of all, I can do that. Second, I get the whole summers off. I can go canoeing.
I knew there was a good gig in there somewhere.
That's it. If it hadn't been for the summers off, I never could have done the things that I did.
How many years did you teach biology in school?
Well, I taught more than biology. I taught biology, I taught earth science, and I developed this program called environmental science, which was very, very successful. That'd be a little over, right at 35 years. So as soon as the year 35 came along and I could get out, man, I was gone. Never missed it for a second.
But you had a full career as a school teacher. You had your summers off. You always loved the outdoors. You loved canoeing.
Yep.
Now tell us how you fall in love with canoeing and how you become the expert, because we really look to you as the expert.
Well, first of all, I discovered a canoe at the age of 11 in a rustic scout camp set deep in the northern Michigan. And in those days, we had wood canvas canoes, okay? So you had to do two things with those boats. One, you had to learn how to paddle well, or you're going to crash and burn. Secondly, you had to learn how to repair them, because every time you'd go down a river, you'd have a tear in the canvas, you'd have whatever. So you learn both of those things. And I became really fascinated with the canoe at 11 or 12 years old, because it was not like backpacking. Backpacking, you're on a trail. All right. Other people have gone down this trail. You're following this trail all the time. Well, you could say the same thing about a river, except every bend in a river is new. It's different. There can be lots of people canoeing on a river, but either they're ahead of you or behind you. Okay. So you basically don't see them. Okay. And when you camp, you're like up away a bit. When you're backpacking on a trail, you're going to run into people. You also carry less when you're backpacking. When you're canoeing, you can carry more stuff. You can live a little bit more elegantly. But I really became fascinated with the canoe itself, what you could do with it, what you couldn't do with it. I was also into sailing too. I did a lot of, we had small boats. I did a lot of small boat sailing too. So that's really how I got into it. And then when I went to college, it sort of faded out. It was always there, it faded out. But it came back after I got out of the Army. I was still into shooting, but then I remembered my canoeing days. And a friend of mine, the way it really started, a friend of mine called me, and he was a fellow shooter like me. We'd, go to the range and shoot. And he says, Cliff, he says, I bought a canoe. I said, oh, hey, man, I used to do that when I was young. He says, you want to go on a canoe trip with me? I said, yeah, let's go. So I went down the river with him in this canoe, and I said, oh my God, I forgot how much fun this was. I got to have a canoe. And that's how it started. And it started like most people with kind of a pretty crappy canoe, which I thought was wonderful at the time. I loved it so much that when we went on canoe trips and I took it off my car, I'd chain it to a tree because I was afraid somebody was going to steal it. Now, as I look back on that first fiberglass canoe, it was a piece of junk, but at the time I thought it was wonderful, And then it just grew. It just grew from there. And then I started doing, first of all, I read everything about canoeing and camping that there ever was when I was a kid. Not just once, but so many times that I can still quote from guys like Calvin Rutstrom, for example, who was my hero. So I learned from those guys. And then I started doing this stuff. And I discovered that there were some things that didn't work. And I started reading the newer canoeing literature and shaking my head and saying, you know what? These guys, they did a bunch of research, and what they came up with was wrong. They're not spending enough time in the woods. And I bitched and moaned about it. And I said, so finally my wife, I was married to Sharon at the time. She says, well, if that's how you feel, why don't you write an article about it? I said, okay, I will. And so I wrote my first article, and Harry Roberts was the editor of a magazine called Wilderness Camping, and he picked it up. And then that was just the beginning. And then I kind of made a vow. Then I wrote for a few more magazines, and then E.P. Dutton, editor, contacted me, and she says, we'd like you to write a book on canoeing. I said, what? A book? A book? She said, yeah, you can do this, Cliff. Okay. And so I did it, but I vowed that everything in that book would be from the experience of me or other experts that I knew. Okay. And I've sort of kept that attitude through all of my writing. For example, those people who've read my flagship book, Canoeing Wild Rivers, knows that there's commentary input from over 30 top North American paddlers. So I don't I don't know everything about this sport. And actually, I don't consider myself an expert.
Oh, we disagree with you. We all do.
No, I'll tell you a little story. I would say when it comes to camping techniques, I would say I'm an expert. There aren't too many people who do wilderness camping better than me. Okay. When it comes to canoeing, I would say I am a polished intermediate. And so I'll tell you a story.
I think you're being very humble, Cliff.
No. I'm going to tell you the story. This is many years ago. I built my first wood strip solo canoe. Named it Man-Toy. Man-Toy. It was a wood strip. It was a high volume solo wood strip canoe. There weren't very many solo canoes then. Of course, I was teaching, didn't have much money, so I built a boat. So there's a place in Minnesota called Taylor Falls. It's on the St. Croix River, and it's a dells with big high cliffs on both sides, and it's a kind of a powerful Class 2 rapid that runs through there. Gets bigger than that when it rains, but basically it's a big rapid with big waves. And they had set up, I was there when they were setting up national whitewater slalom course. They're putting up the gates. So they had the gates up. So I was just playing around in my wood strip canoe, and came to shore. And this young woman, whose name I remember after all these years, I think she had red hair. She was probably 19, 20 years old, something like that. Her name was Kristen Frisch. And Kristen was trying out for the U.S. whitewater team. And so she says, you know, Cliff, she says, I watch you paddle. She says, you're pretty good. She says, I'm paddling solo. She says, but I want to do some tandem runs. She says, would you paddle bow with me in a tandem and we'll, you know, run the gates? I said, yeah, sure, why not? So we did that a few times. And then afterwards we went to shore, and she says to me, she says, Cliff, you know, you're pretty good at this. She says, you know, why don't you try out? I think you could be competitive. And I said, no. I said, I'll be honest with you, Kristen. Big rapids kind of freak me out. And she looked me right in the eye and she said, you know, Cliff, you got more skill than guts. Okay. And I value that. I value that because that is precisely how I've gotten down these Arctic rivers and come back alive. Okay. Which means what happens is I look at a rapid and I'll say, you know, I think I can probably do that. But no, I don't think so, because I got $5,000 worth of gear and my life in this boat. No, we're going to line or portage. Whereas I've been with people who are much better paddlers than me, they just go for it and they get in trouble. So having this attitude has made me very proud. And so, yeah, I like being a polished intermediate paddler.
Well, we'll let you be humble. How's that?
Well,
but Cliff, I want to ask you a question here. And I want to go back, because if we have, you know, we're coming out of at the tail end of COVID here, and a lot of people are trying new things in the outdoors, and everyone's being welcoming to, hey, try this, try canoeing, try camping, doing all of this. What advice would you give to somebody brand new who said, you know what, we rented some equipment, we liked it, and now they want to get into canoeing and canoe camping? What's some advice you can give for a beginner?
Okay, well, first of all, let's define a couple things: canoeing versus kayaking. Kayaking has become real popular for basically two reasons. One, you go alone. Number two, you people think, oh, you really don't have to know anything. You just take a paddle and go blah, 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 blah. Okay, and that for most people is enough, because that's all they want to do is go blah, 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 blah across a pond or a lake. They don't want to learn any more than that. So that works for them, but they think it's easier than canoeing. It's not. The difference is that the learning curve with a kayak is simple at the start. La, 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 back and forth, back and forth. But when you get into moving water, you got to learn braces and eddy turns and peel outs and rolls. And that takes a lot of time. A canoe, on the other hand, is hard at the start, but it gets easier as you learn. So if you were to graph the two, the kayak would be real easy at the start. You'd say, bingo, the graph is high, and then it gets easier. With a canoe, it's exactly the opposite, because people have to start by overcoming the one thing that they have trouble with: keeping the canoe going straight. Okay? Keeping it going straight. So a lot of them adopt this, just switch sides. We'll call hut, switch, or whatever, and we'll switch sides. That's a racing stroke. But you know what? You got to get beyond that and learn how to keep the canoe running straight. Once you do that, then you start learning a whole bunch of other strokes. So the question is, how do you get to that point? The first thing I would tell a beginner to do is, number one, if you have the chance, and there is a store or something like that that has a canoe day where you can go out and try canoes, go to that and learn from them. They'll teach you. All right. If you can't do that where you live, read a book or see a video. Okay. And you can learn a tremendous amount just from reading a book. Example, I don't know, do I have time for an example or not?
Absolutely.
All right. All right. So many years ago, I was guiding a canoe trip on the Kopka River in Ontario. Two of the people that were along were from Switzerland. Now they had heard of this technique called a back ferry, okay, which allows you to go across a river, straight across a river by paddling backwards. For listeners, you've probably seen ducks do a forward ferry. If ducks want to cross a river with a current, they face upstream, they turn their little bodies at about a 30 or 45-degree angle to the current, and they paddle forward, and the ducks go straight across the river. Well, that would be called a forward ferry in a canoe, only we have to do it backwards. Well, anyway, these guys had seen videos about this and read about it in books, but they had never, ever done it. So I said, okay, I'm going to model this. We have to do this because there's a log across this river and it was a rapid. I said, you got to get over the river right. So I modeled it, went across. They went across. They were a little bit like shaky, and they did it just fine. And I remember Ole said to me, he said, I had it in my mind how I was going to do this. And he said, and I think I could have done it. He says, but when I saw you do it, he said, yep, then it set it in my brain and I was able to do it. So you could, and another example from learning from books, there was a book called Basic River Canoeing by Bob McNair. Basic River Canoeing is still in print, okay? And it's whitewater technique. It's how I learned my whitewater technique. And then one day I took a class from the Minnesota Canoe Association, and it started out in a swimming pool. And the guy I was paddling with I still remember his name, was Al Button. He was on the U.S. whitewater team, okay? In fact, he was one of the first guys that actually used switching sides. They said, oh my God, you never switch sides in a rapid. Well, Al would do that anyway. He's pretty competitive. So anyway, I was paddling bow with Al, and he was a big, powerful muscle guy. And man, it took everything I had to keep that canoe from spinning around. And then afterwards, he said to me, he says, Cliff, he says, you've been in one of these boats before, haven't you? I said, no, Al, I never have. And he looked at me quizzically and he said, what? I said, no, I read a lot. Oh, he just sort of looked at me funny like. So yes, that's how I would start. Because the thing is, if you don't start by learning from either books or videos or hands-on, you're going to do it wrong. And then it's going to take a long time to break that. Okay.
You bring up a great point, Cliff, and this is a good transition for our listeners, because you're saying people can learn well from reading and doing like you did when you started. You said earlier, I read and I reread and I read again. And for our listeners, I want to read a couple of things here. These are books, folks, that have been written by Cliff Jacobson, who is our guest today. Canoeing Wild Rivers, Boundary Waters Canoe Camping, Camping's Top Secrets, Basic Essentials, Solo Canoeing, Cooking in the Outdoors, Map and Compass, Knots for the Outdoors, and most recently, a fictional novel, Justin Cody's Race to Survival. My count is that there's 10 books written there, and out of those, or 9, excuse me, and out of those 9 books, 8 of those are all things that people can, and we're going to talk where they can buy those and get those, where they can go learn, read, use them as references to begin, or for somebody who just wants to learn more, they can go to this. So let's talk a little bit about, you had said people had asked you to write articles, and then somebody said write a book. Which one of these books was that first one? And then consequently, you wrote a lot more and have become a prolific writer. Bring us into that a little bit.
Well, the first book I wrote was called Wilderness Canoeing and Camping. It was published by E.P. Dutton Company in 1977. Okay. And then ultimately, Dutton, I don't remember what happened with Dutton at this point, but then another little publisher came along, ICS Books, and they asked me to revise that book. And then I went from there into Falcon Books. So that book had been in print from 1977 until last year. That's a 35-year run. Then that was called Wilderness Canoeing and Camping, and they killed it. And then in 1984, then I wanted to do something nobody had ever done. When you write a canoeing book or a kayaking book, all right, if it's a canoe or kayaking camping book, you have a problem. The problem is you have a boat here and you have to teach people how to paddle it. That takes half the book. So now you got your publisher says you only got so much space. So what happens is you got the remaining space over here, which isn't very much. You can't say that much. So you can't really say anything different than a dozen other canoeing books have said. So I said, Canoeing Wild Rivers is going to be different. Know how to paddle stuff. There's none of that. You want to learn how to paddle? Get a how to paddle book. Canoeing Wild Rivers is going to be the nuts and bolts of making a wilderness canoe trip. The things that you can only find out by going to canoe clubs, listening to canoeing and camping clubs, to experts, okay? Not just to your own experience, because a lot of people have a lot of experiences that just, they don't work, okay? I get a lot of heat from people on certain things that I recommend, okay? And they roll their eyes at some of the things I recommend, notably the ground cloth inside the tent, notably the fact that bears climb trees, and there's a bunch of other ones. But here's how I describe that to them so they understand. They just haven't had things bad enough and long enough, okay? Example, let's say you and your friend are out for a drive. Now, you've been driving for 40 years. Your friend's sitting next to you. He's an accomplished race car driver. So you're talking and you're getting this turn and you're going a little bit too fast, so you hit the brakes. And your friend turns to you and says, not a good idea to hit the brakes in the middle of a curve. You turn to your friend and say, hey man, what do you mean? I've been doing this for 40 years, no problem. He turns to you and he says, try that at twice the speed. Okay? So I guess what I'm saying is the stuff that I recommend in these books, I'm going twice the speed. If you're not going twice the speed, those things will work for you. But the reason why people who do these northern trips, these difficult trips, are considered opinionated, no, it's not being opinionated. It's, you know what it is? It's wisdom. We've tried those things. They don't work. This is what works. So the other people say, well, this works fine for me. Yeah, you go to the Boundary Waters. Okay, Boundary Waters is a pretty forgiving place. I love the Boundary Waters. Don't get me wrong. I go there every year. Okay, but what works in the Boundary Waters is not going to work on a wild Canadian river. And if you don't have those skills, you're going to crash and burn. That's going twice the speed. So that's how I kind of got into this stuff. I decided to write that book filled with things that you're not going to find anyplace else, and they can sort out the how to paddle, you know, in other books and whatever. And I keep learning. You know, I keep changing every time I do a book revision. Like we just revised Camping's Top Secrets. Okay, that just came out. Wow, it just came out this month, just off the press right now. That's been in print since what? I don't know, 1985, something like that. I don't know, but that's 35 years, and that book's done a good run. So you keep, and people say, you know, well, Cliff, you change your mind. You know, it's different in this book than it was last revision. I said, yes, because I'm always learning. And if you don't keep learning, you don't move forward. So yes, I keep refining ideas. Sorry, I didn't mean to go into a rant here.
No, that's fine, because we can all learn from you because you have more experience than all of us, Cliff. You brought up two things. You said, you know, almost like spoiler alert, bears do climb trees. Well, help us out with that.
Well, here's, you know, those of you who have read my books, Canoeing Wild Rivers, and especially the new edition of Camping's Top Secrets has more in it. There's tons of information about bears, but it's really, really simple. Bears climb trees. Black bears climb trees, and they climb very, very well. Indeed, if you go down to the Smoky Mountains National Park, the bears in Smoky Mountains National Park, they overwinter in trees. They make nests in trees. So, so the question becomes, and federal authorities are going to be real unhappy with me, and they are over this, but it's a fact. If bears climb trees, what good does it do to put your food up in a tree? And the answer to the question is simple. Federal authorities don't care if a bear gets your food or tears up your car. They do care if a bear gets you. So how do we fix that? Well, first of all, you have to remember that you can't come up with this with some. Most people who go to the wilderness, they're not stupid. They just are not at home in the wilderness. They don't understand. So what you have to do is come up with some situation to keep them safe. And the answer is you have people here and you have bears there. If you keep them apart, there won't be a problem. All right, so how do you keep them apart? You can't tell people to walk out in the woods 200 feet and drop a pack because they don't know how far 200 feet is. They'll go 20 feet, okay, or whatever. But you can tell them to put it up in a tree. So if you, and then what you do is you make a rule for the tree. Like the limb has to be, I don't remember what it is, at least 12 feet off the ground or something, and the limb has to be 3 feet out. You know what? And if you go to a place like the Boundary Waters, which is like like an edge environment. In other words, the trees are starting to get smaller now. The further north you go, the smaller they get until you get up into northern Canada or get in Alaska. Then you have basically you have no trees at all, okay? And you get on the barrens. But there are not very many trees in the Boundary Waters that meet the specifications of federal authorities, okay? Read the print. All right, so which means you can't find a tree like that, so you're just going to haul it up to whatever's available. Then what happens is the feds are off the hook because all of a sudden, Teddy Bear climbs up that tree, gets your pack, you complain to the feds, and the feds say, all right, what tree did you have? Where would you have it? And that tree, sir, oh, well, that didn't meet that didn't meet federal specifications. That tree is only 10 feet tall, or that pack was only 2 feet out. It needs to be whatever. But the point is, that's all it does. And years ago, I remember giving a bear talk at Canoecopia in Madison. I think there was about 500 people in the audience, standing room only, to people. Okay, I want to know how many of you people have had food that has been taken by bears, pack that's been taken by bears. There was maybe 25, 30 people out of that 500 that had their hands up. And then I said, okay, now I want you to put your hand up if you had your pack in a tree when the bear got it. It was something like over 90% of the 30 had their food in a tree. Now, what does this tell you? Okay, it tells you that it doesn't work. It doesn't work. But people still do it because it's been in the literature for years. And you know what? Once stuff gets in the literature, it's hard to get it out. I have a buddy of mine, Doc Forgy, Bill Forgy. He wrote the book Wilderness Medicine. And he tells a story, you know, you remember, some of you guys that are listeners might be old enough to remember the back pressure arm lift of artificial respiration. Remember that? We grew up with that. Doc said they knew it didn't work. It stayed in the literature for decades before they finally got it out. That's what's happening with the bears and the trees. It's what's happening with people. The people who give me grief about the ground cloth inside the tent, their problem is they don't know the history of tents. Okay.
Let's go back to the bears though. We'll come to the ground cloth, but where should we put our packs when we're in the, let's say just for the people who are going to go to the Boundary Waters, the people that'll go to the Quetico, where should we put it, Cliff?
All right. You know, we don't have a lot of time. I would say people read about it in Canoeing Wilderness or the new edition of Camping's Top Secrets. But briefly, it's like this. Here's what I tell people. If a bear can't see your food or smell your food, he won't get your food. Let's talk smell first. People think, oh, a feather drops from a tree. A bear can smell the feather, whatever. Come on. Yeah, they have good smell, but they're not magical beasts, okay? If you have a bear a quarter of a mile away across the lake and you're in a Boundary Waters campsite, that bear is not smelling your freeze-dried, vacuum-sealed, Mylar-packed chicken tetrazzini. What that bear is smelling is you. And that bear says, people in campsite 21, food, bam, and he comes. Now, when he gets in there, he's going to start looking for food. Bears are incredibly smart animals. If you don't think so, just ask yourself why it is that Native Americans wear bear teeth, okay, on necklaces. These animals are smart. They teach their children, all right? They pass on stuff, okay? They don't goof up. They don't make the same mistakes over and over again. So that bear learns real fast. Now, if that bear has gotten into a pack that had food once, now he's been operantly conditioned. Any pack he sees, he's taken apart. I've seen him take apart packs that just have clothes in them, never had food in them. Now, if he keeps getting negative, results, then he'll stop doing that. But once he's in your camp, he's going to start looking around for things that food could be in, and he's going to take it apart.
Probably up in the tree, right?
And if it's up in a tree, he's going to climb that tree, or he's going to send the cubs up, okay? And if the pack is out there, the cubs will launch themselves out like a missile to grab the pack on the way down. In fact, they have a name for these packs in the tree in the Western United States. They call them bear piñatas. And that comment is published in my book, Canoeing Wild Rivers, and it comes from a wildlife biologist. Bear piñatas.
Your recommendation then is for us to do what?
I would say if a bear can't smell your food or see your food, he won't get it. So if you pack so you don't have odors and you put your packs where a bear can't see them, you're probably pretty much home free. In a place like the Boundary Waters, I would say if you're worried about it, just set it out of camp under a tree somewhere and forget about it, and you'll probably be fine, okay? The problem is that people ask these questions. I had a guy at Canoecopia raise my hand and say, Cliff, you should take your food out of camp and hide it under a tree. Question, quote, where does camp end? Where does camp end? Think about that for a minute. Where does camp end? Duh, man, I don't know. Okay, so what's happening is people are looking for a foolproof method. There's nothing foolproof. Okay, you just do the best you can. But people will do a lot of dumb things, like, I stick my food in a canoe and I sit the canoe out and I tie it onto a tree. Okay, that's real smart. Big wind comes along, waves come along, the canoe is going to capsize, going to get damaged. And by the way, do you ever see how animals travel? Do you even have a clue? They use trails, okay? They have little trails and they have little highways. And guess what? They forage along the shore because there's a lot of dead stuff washes up on the shore. I got a canoe full of gear, a canoe full of packs, okay? So that's what I would tell people probably in the Boundary Waters. And the only reason why I suggest like that is because the bears in the Boundary Waters are pretty much operantly conditioned to know that food comes in trees, food comes in packs. Where there are people in camps, there are food. If you go north into Canada, it's a different ball game, and you don't have to do that silliness. Okay.
Let's talk about your tent situation and tarps and tents.
First of all, you have to understand something about tents to begin with. Every manufacturer is competing with every other manufacturer to get their tents out there. And when people pick up the annual issue of magazines like Backpacker, where they rate all this stuff and they give the weight and the bulk of these things, a lot of people are going to gravitate to the tent that has the lightest weight and the less bulk. So what manufacturers have done is they roll these tents up as tight as they can, and they put them in stuff sacks that are too small, so they look real small on the shelf. They do things like that. Instead of having that the tent may actually need eight or 10 stakes. They'll go with half that number, okay, because every stake you save probably is a quarter a stake. Every stake loop you have to sew is another 10 cents or whatever it is, because they've done their market research and they understand that the average tent that goes to people is going to be used about 6 or 7 days a year max under ideal conditions. And if it's not ideal, they're going to get in their Volvos and drive home. Okay. So first of all, if you're serious about the outdoors, you want to get a good tent. All right. And it's going to cost you more than what you think. You're not going to get a good tent for $100 or $120, but you can take a $120 tent and you can modify it so that it will work under severe conditions. You'll find that in my books, Camping's Top Secrets, a little on some in the Boundary Waters book, and of course in Canoeing Wild Rivers. That means sitting there with a sewing machine for a few hours, okay, to sew extra stake loops on after stakes and stuff, okay. And so you might say, well, why don't manufacturers do this for you? And the answer is because they want to save weight and bulk and money. And if they did it, there would be people who would write and say, hey, man, there's 24 stake loops on this tent. You only sent me 8 stakes. What? I need 24 to set this up. Now we got to educate people. Now, failing that, there's one thing that people can do that I will almost totally guarantee you will never get water in your tent again. It's very simple. You just get a waterproof piece of plastic at your local hardware store. It's the same stuff they put up for painting. I think it's about 3 mil thick. You make it a foot larger than the tent all around, and you put that inside your tent. You do not use a ground cloth underneath the tent. You put this inside the tent, and then if it rains hard enough and long enough, I don't care if you got $1 million tent, water's probably going to come in your tent, okay? Because you can't always choose the campsite perfectly. All right, if it comes in your tent, it will be trapped between the plastic and the floor and you will stay dry. Now, I have lots of stories how this has completely saved my bacon, but we basically don't have time to tell them. But I would leave people with this thought, people who are so concerned that I have this $500 tent and I'm going to put holes in the bottom. Well, I'll do you one better, guys. I got a Hilberg tent that's $1,000. That's the tent that I use most of the time now. Okay, that tent always has a ground cloth on the inside, never under the floor. For 15 years or thereabouts, I outfitted and guided a canoe trip in the far north for the Science Museum of Minnesota. I provided Cannondale rustic tents for everybody. Those tents in 1970s were $350 each. They'd be $1,000 tents today. We always had interior ground sheets. Ultimately, I sold those tents about 6 years ago. After 15 or 20 years of use, there was not a hole in the floor of one of them. Why? Because when you put that plastic inside the tent, you've doubled the thickness of the floor, okay? And the coating, waterproof coating on the floor, is on the inside of the tent. So if you've ever, I wonder if listeners know what a green stick break is. A green stick is you take a green stick and you bend it. It elongates on top, compresses on bottom. It always breaks on the elongation side, never on compression. That's what happens when a thorn goes through the floor of your tent. If you could watch this with a microscope, as the thorn goes in, it starts pushing the fibers apart until ultimately it breaks the coating on the inside. Okay. Now, put that plastic ground cloth on top of that. It can't get through. And furthermore, without that ground cloth on the inside, every time you shove a sleeping bag in, a foam pad, climb in there yourself, you're rubbing a micro thin layer of that coating off the inside of the floor. Now, I'll leave viewer or listeners with this one thought. When they coat the floors of these tents on the inside, it's somewhere around 100 pounds per square inch of water pressure is what that coating is supposed to take, somewhere in that neighborhood. That sounds like a huge amount, doesn't it? Well, guess what? Take a 200-pound person and kneel on one knee with all your weight on one knee. Now see what you got. You know what? I submit you're probably getting pretty close to 100 psi. All right. So, so the point is that camp in a low area long enough, water's coming in that tent, put a ground cloth on the inside, you will never be wet again. And yes, you will prevent holes in the tent floor. Old ideas die hard. Some of them just won't die.
This has been wonderful advice, Cliff, and so many people can learn from you just listening today, but then reading your books, and we're going to go through that. But I want to hit one other subject. There's a wonderful pack, and it's a little commercial for Duluth Pack, but Duluth Pack made this pack many years ago, and it's actually in the Duluth Pack store now, and it's affectionately known as the Wedding Pack. Can you tell our listeners about the infamous Wedding Pack?
Yeah, the Wedding Pack is a number 2 Duluth Pack. It was white, and there was a reason for that. When I was guiding these canoe trips in northern Canada and you portage on the tundra, you really need stuff to stand out. And so we used to actually put a ribbon on there, you know, surveying ribbon, different colors. And so I asked Duluth Pack to make me up white packs. So a lot of my packs were white. Well, this particular pack, Susie decided to marry me on a canoe trip on the Hood River, which is north of the Arctic Circle. And her wedding dress and all the wedding cake and all the stuff like that was in this white pack. And so we took off. We flew out of Yellowknife, which then was Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, capital of Northwest Territories. And when the plane landed, we all got out and unloaded. And Susie says, well, where's the wedding pack? It wasn't there. So she cut a hissy fit and she said, well, I'm not getting married without the pack, without my wedding dress. I'm not. And so then the guy started fooling around. One guy says, well, you know, we can make you a dress out of white poly bags. Okay. And another one said, yeah, you can use my head net for a veil. But she was ticked. She was really ticked. And so this was actually the very first night. We're camped in the tundra. Susie is really ticked off, and she's saying, I'm not getting married. I'm not going through with this wedding. We'd asked one of the guys on the trip to be quote, a wedding commissioner. Well, the full story is in the book Canoeing Wild Rivers. And he agreed to marry us. She says, no, I'm not getting married. So then all of a sudden, I hear the drone of a plane overhead. I immediately picked up my radio. I had at the time I carried an aircraft radio. And so I tuned into their channel. I knew what the channel was. And I said, it was a Twin Otter from Airtindi. I said, Airtindi, Twin Otter, this is the Cliff Jacobson party, over. And he came in, he says, yep. He says, hey, we got your pack. He says, you left it on the dock over at the loading dock at Airtindi. He says, Michael Peake, who was a famous Canadian writer and paddler, Mike found it and said, oh, gee, Cliff really needs this. I know they're getting married on the Hood. Can you deliver it? Well, this plane was going to Cambridge Bay. So he said, well, we just diverted to the Hood. And so what they did was they kicked it out the door. Now, that's pretty dangerous. You know, you got to open the door. This big twin engine plane is flying. I think it's like 100 feet off the ground. He kicked this thing out the door and it just landed like a missile. The wedding was back on again. So then, and it had a hole in it where it hit. And by the way, there's a patch, as you probably noticed on that pack. That patch covers a hole that when that pack landed, it made that hole in the pack. Okay, so then when we got back, we got to thinking, this is really a special pack. I think we should donate this to Duluth Pack. And Susie agreed. And so I went, I don't remember who ran Duluth Pack then, but they said that they would take good care of it. And you guys have, and it hangs up there. It's faded. The ribbons, which are all white now, are all bright pink at one time, because Susie put those ribbons on afterwards. She says, I'm not losing this pack. So yeah, that's the story. That's the story of the pack. So those of you who visit Duluth Pack, you see that pack there. Like I say, you can read about it. You can read about it. The whole story is in Canoeing Wild Rivers. It's kind of a magical story. And I'm not religious or anything like that, but it's very magical because there were some things that happened that are during that wedding time that we can't figure out, that are unaccountable.
What a wonderful story. And folks, you can find that pack and the picture of Cliff and Susie holding that pack, signed and dated from their wedding, in the Duluth Pack store. It's a special story for us. We keep that away from hands, but people can ask where it is and we'll show them where it is located in the store. Cliff, you know what? You're such an icon in the industry. You've been on over 40 big expeditions. You've written all of these books. Tell our listeners where they can find your books. They can find many of them at the Duluth Pack store. We have them on our website, but where can they also find them? Your website?
They can go to my website, which is cliffcanoe.com, all one word, cliffcanoe.com. And they can peruse them. They can order them there, and they will be autographed. Or if they don't want to order them there, there's a link right there, and they can get them on Amazon. Amazon, I can't compete with Amazon. They can buy the books and sell the books cheaper than I can. So if you want to save a few bucks, go on my website, look it up. And if you don't like my price, go ahead, click the Amazon link, and buy them there. But if I may, before we leave the books, I really would like to say a word or two about this Justin Cody book, if I can.
Yes, please.
Well, that book, I wrote a book and everybody keeps calling it fiction. The fact is, it isn't. And that's kind of the problem with, if there's a problem, that's the problem with the book. I came up with this idea because I was questioning why all the people we're seeing in the wilderness today have gray hairs. I said, how do I get kids involved in the wilderness? I said, kids who like to read will read. I read all these books when I was a kid, but most kids don't know if they like to read or not because they got their head in their cell phone or iPad all day long. So I said, but if I can write a novel that will be adventurous, keep them really entertained, but surround that novel with skills so that they actually learn skills. And that's what I did. And everything in that book that happens actually did happen. No, not in all one person or one time, but everything in that book has happened to people I know. So that's all nonfiction. And the skills are all nonfiction. So when I went to try to get this book published, and I thought it would have been easy because I've authored so many books, publishers came back, hey, Cliff, we do nonfiction. We don't do fiction. I go to fiction publishers, we do fiction, we don't do nonfiction. Evidently, nobody's ever done a book like this. Evidently, nobody's ever mixed the two together. And I don't know why, because I think it's a great way to teach young people. So I would say, if you have a youngster who you want to get to learn to really like canoeing and camping, have them read this book. It's written for 8th graders. I used to teach 8th grade, but sharp 6th, 7th, 5th, 6th, 7th graders can probably read it all, but they'll learn the skills along the way and they'll be entertained too. And adults seem to like it too. So that's why I did that particular book, because I'm really concerned that we're just not getting that many young people coming up these days.
So folks, we're going to get into the final section of the podcast today, and that is the packed question segment. And we're going to rapid fire these, Cliff. What is Cliff Jacobson's favorite movie?
My favorite movie is one that most people have probably never heard of. It's called Rabbit Proof Fence. It's a
Rabbit Proof Fence. We need to go look that up.
It's a true story. It's an Australian film about an Indigenous girl and her 2 sisters. And back in the time when Australia was rounding these kids up and putting them on a train, sending them 1,000 miles away to a school so they could be educated like, quote, white people and do household chores. This girl, she was only about, I think, 13, if I remember right, 13 or 14. She ran away from the school with her 2 sisters, walked 1,000 miles back home, living off the land. They were all trying to catch her. They had the Australian police after her. They never could catch her. It's a wonderful story. It's called Rabbit Proof Fence. That's my favorite.
And what is your number one bucket list item that Cliff Jacobson has yet to do?
You know what? I really don't have any bucket list items left at this point. I think I pretty much have done what I want, or really what I want to do. I guess my bucket list item now, I turned 81 this year, is to remain healthy enough to keep doing what I love. So,
you can knock me over with a feather, 81 years old. That is amazing. And you know what? You live a very blessed life if you say, I've accomplished my bucket list items. I've never heard that in our podcast yet.
Okay.
Cliff, your favorite meal on an expedition?
My favorite meal on an expedition is not just it's my crew's favorite meal. It always keeps coming back to, there's two of them that they love the most. And one is the shiitake ramen soup with hamburger and veggies. Very, very simple meal. It's in my books. Now, all my meals are simple because I used to run these trips for 10 people. When you're cooking for 10 people and you're above the Arctic Circle and the water temperature is 42 degrees, you got to use some tricks. Okay. And the other really favorite one is a steam fried pizza. That I make a steam fried pizza. That's in the book too. That takes approximately 1 minute to make each pizza, and it's better than those ones that you're going to try to make from scratch as the pizza. Believe it. I'm going to have
to try that. I'm going to
steam fried
pull up the.
It's very, very simple. It's fried, but it's steam fried, and the directions are in I think canoeing. It's in Canoeing Wild Rivers. It's in Boundary Waters. Well, I can't even, but it's in a number of my different books, whatever. Yeah.
And our last pack question is, what's the best piece of life advice that you have ever received?
The best piece of life advice I ever received was, I think, from when Kristen Frisch said, you have more guts. No, you have more skill than you have guts. I think the best advice is, if you have the ability and you downplay that a little bit when you are in dangerous situations, you're going to be just fine. So that's a piece of advice I really value.
And I hope people take that from you when they're on their next expedition.
Me too.
And I hope that people share this podcast with their kids, because you are very inspiring. You're very excited when you talk about the outdoors and canoeing and camping and getting people outdoors. And that can be so powerful for young kids to try something different, Cliff. We appreciate it. We appreciate you, what you've done for the outdoors, what you've done for the outdoor community, the camping community, the canoeing community. Folks, our special guest today has been the one and only Cliff Jacobson, educator, expert camper, and above average canoeist, as he humbly says, and award-winning author. Cliff, thanks so much for taking your time and being here today. We could go on and on and on. Follow Cliff on his social handles, buy his books, support small business like Cliff and or Duluth Pack, and buy those books so that he can continue to do what he does. Thank you, Cliff. We appreciate you so much.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Appreciate it. Thank you.
This has been wonderful. Folks, until next time, and I think Cliff would agree with me, unplug from the indoors and recharge in the outdoors.